Okay. So, about the same time, another theory starts plunking along, and that theory is known as New Classical Economics. The guy in this picture is also still alive, and he's also an American, and his name is Robert Lucas. And he did a couple of exciting things for us. One is what's called the Lucas critique. And it's called that because in the title of the article where he came up with this, he used the word critique, and so everybody stole that word, and that's the Lucas critique. Okay? What Lucas basically is going to say to us is we do these, the Keynesians in particular, create these huge mathematical models of how the economy works. What Lucas says is when times change, when we change what we're doing on policy or the economy undergoes a radical shift from, no virus to virus or whatever, the equations will change. So if you try to use equations from 2019 to predict what's going to happen through 2020, those equations are not going to work because the equations themselves change. It's not just economic conditions that change. If you're going to try to create equations that describe the economy, the equations change. And so it's impossible to do what the Keynesians want to do, which is produce these mathematical models and then tweak the economy. Know that you got to add 10 here or 5 there or whatever it is. You can't. All right? Just doesn't work. And Keynes actually said that a long time ago, but the Keynesians and Keynes are two different animals. When in 2009, when Ben Bernanke's giving speeches about, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve at that point, about the thing, what he says is one of the things we learned is that our models don't work right in these situations. Well, okay, you've known that since the 70s at least. You've known that since the Lucas critique, that you wouldn't have expected your models to work. Okay? He's also responsible for getting into economics something called rational expectations. Rational expectations basically says that people understand the way the system works and they're rational, and therefore their expectations of the future might always turn out to be right, but their expectations of the future are going to match kind of with what happens. And we'll talk about that more when we get to chapter 17 because they're in there. All right? And then Lucas says, in economic policy, the frontier never changes. The issue is always mercantilism and government intervention versus laissez-faire and free markets. The people who came before Adam Smith we call mercantilists. And they believed that the government was required to make the economy work correctly. That if we left the economy alone, it would not work correctly. So you have you have these old mercantilists, and basically he's saying the Keynesians are mercantilists, or the modernism. Do we need government in the system, or will laissez-faire and free markets, is that the best way? Is hands-off and free markets the best way to run things? And he says that's that fundamental argument. And clearly we've been having that argument for 200-something years. Okay. So these two guys are Keidland and Prescott. They won the Nobel Prize, mostly for inventing this thing called real business cycles. Real business cycles is the kind of the last revision that we've had of supply-side economics. And basically it says, there is no difference between the SRAS and the LRAS. The short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve are the same curve. Almost. That the SRAS is vertical, that real and nominal are always separate. If that's true, the government, not only shouldn't the government be involved in changing the economy, but if these guys are right, the government can't create jobs and can't do anything meaningful in the economy. Okay? Because the SRS is just vertical, the only thing that happens when the government acts is to create inflation and changes in productivity. Worker productivity can move short-run aggregate supply. So there's all kinds of plus jokes, and there's people who are adamant, and this is a highly controversial theory. the modern version of the Keynesians would say there's not one single bit of evidence that any recession has ever happened because of one of these. And so it's an ongoing argument, right? This is the most recent variant of classical economics. And of course, we have to argue because we're economists. Okay. John Maynard Keynes. As the Great Depression happens in the 30s, late 20s and into the 30s, both in England and the United States, the governments turned to this guy to tell them what to do. And his first answer, his joking answer, but his first answer was that the British government could just bury bottles of money all across England and let people go dig them up. And that way people would get put to work and they'd make money, and that would solve the Great Depression. Okay? So his theory is no. This little stuff isn't the problem. We need to look at the big picture. The big picture and the little picture don't exactly add up to each other. Okay? So there's a theory that says sometimes you can't add up all the pieces and get the whole. And Keynes essentially believes that markets by themselves, just because you say, look, all these markets appear to be in equilibrium or whatever they are, that doesn't mean the whole economy is in good shape. Okay? No? All right. Spending matters. In Keynes's model, the nominal and the real are just connected with each other. There isn't the real matters and the nominal doesn't, or the nominal matters and the real doesn't. The two of them are interconnected. You can't escape the idea that what you do, prices don't matter. You can't say that. Prices do matter. Wages do matter. The absolute value of our wage does matter to us, and the real value of our wage matters to us. Everything matters. Nominal and real are connected together all the time. All right? Now, the most important part of his theory is about financial markets and his incorporating financial markets into his view of macroeconomics. He says that financial markets are like casinos, that most often when we have economic problems, it's because the financial markets are screwed up. He says that most people aren't very smart and that they follow their animal spirits. In other words, they're all running around trying to figure out what to do. They see three people run off a certain direction. They all run after that person because they figure that person must know something, and everybody jumps off a cliff without realizing it. Okay? Animal spirits. People are not that smart, and they're not doing well thought out answers to things all the time. Very often they just react, and their animal spirits make them do the wrong thing. Okay? And the financial markets are just like casinos. For the normal person, a financial market is just a random event. Okay? And this system is far riskier and far more prone to errors than the classical economists would have you think. Okay? A Keynes quote, "Markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent." So Keynes did not think markets are rational. He did not think things worked in some rational sense. Okay? So here's the bad part of Keynes. There's, well, at least one of the bad parts. Keynes writes his book late 30s. In England, the World War II is already about to start, right? It's pretty close to where it's going to start. It's already, in fact, started in the Pacific. So you have World War II, you have the Great Depression and World War II going on. There isn't a lot of discussion of his theory at that point. And he says, it's going to take a long time before people are willing to accept my theory. So we get to the end of World War II, and before there can be huge discussion, there's some discussion, but before there can be huge discussion of Keynes's theory, he dies. Yeah, he dies. So the people are going to have the most profound effect on his theory. Between them all, they have one brief conversation with Keynes about how his theory should be interpreted. Total. Okay? So the Keynesians actually kind of split, and the Keynesians we talk about are the American Keynesians. The Keynesians in Europe do things differently than the American Keynesians, but we don't really see their work in that influence very much. This guy on the right here is a guy named Paul Samuelson. If you don't believe me that the monetarists and the Keynesians had a fight for well over a decade, Milton Friedman got to write a column for a magazine once a month, and Paul Samuelson got to write a column for the same magazine once a month. So they wrote dueling columns on things in the same magazine for over a decade. Okay? So he is the leader of the Keynesians. The Keynesians. Now, Keynes himself, his kind of favorite student leader of the kind of the European Keynesians is a woman named Joan Robinson, and she's the most famous female economist of all time. A big chunk of what you do in microeconomics and principles comes from her. Okay? She did not like these people. She used a word, she didn't say the Keynesians, she said the B word people whose parents aren't married, Keynesians. I sometimes refer to these people in class as the John Snow Keynesians, if you know what that means, because I don't want to use that word in class. But the one person in all of the Keynesian world who knew Keynes the best had nothing nice to say about what these guys were saying about what Keynes thought. And she didn't like their version of the theory at all as part of Keynes. Anyway, so Paul Samuelson. The best parts, the most important, if you ask Joan Robinson what the most important parts of Keynes' theory are, it's going to be the parts about the financial markets and animal spirits and irrationality, and they just take all that stuff out. Paul Samuelson just takes all that stuff out. Because what he wants to do is combine microeconomic theory and macroeconomic theory. He wants to give you a microeconomic understanding of how Keynes' theory would work. He wants to do math. He wants to create this micro and macro thing. If animal spirits exist the way Keynes they said they did, if he believes that markets are really as irrational, financial markets, as he says they are, then you can't do that. You can't make nice, convenient, cute math out of this theory, but that's what they do. So they develop these mathematical models, all right? Where Keynes says that markets, financial markets are irrational, Paul Samuelson says, investing should be like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. If you want excitement, take $800 and go to Las Vegas. So I use that for two reasons. One is, of course, the Vegas part. But the other part is you can see why Joan Robinson would think that these guys shouldn't be calling themselves Keynesians, because the most exciting part of Keynes' theory, the most innovative part of Keynes' theory, they delete to make their theory, their version of the theory, work. Okay, so this is, again, the dominant theory in macroeconomics in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, and Milton Friedman and the monetarists spend that time fighting with them over what's right and what's wrong, and both of these theories are going to lose that fight.